Welcome, everyone. My name is Joe Swimmer, and I'm the Executive Director of Sate Network, and we are so pleased to have you join us today on the Change is Coming, all about our parochial reports. And the committee that is working on improving the parochial reports for General Convention that'll be taking place not this year, but next year in Baltimore, right up the road from me here. We are so excited to have this panel with us today, and I'm now going to turn it over to Chris Rankin-Williams, Director at St. John's, Ross, California. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us, all of our attendees and all of our panelists. Chris?
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Joe, for inviting us to do this, and thanks to the Sate Network for making this possible. I'm Chris Rankin-Williams. I'm the chair of the House of Deputies Sate of the Church Committee and the chair of our Parochial Report Subcommittee. So that's primarily my role. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, but I want to make sure we introduce all the panelists so they can say something about their work related to the parochial report. We've got a great group of people today addressing all the different elements of the church that interact with the parochial report. So I'm going to invite Jane to introduce herself.
Hi there, I'm Jane Sislusis. I come from the Diocese of Northern Michigan. I am on Executive Council. I chair the Governance and Operations Joint Standing Committee, and our committee receives and helps the Executive Council authorize the report when you all have signed off on it.
Great. Kate?
Hi, I'm Kate Wesch. I'm the rector of St. John's in Essex, Connecticut, and I'm a member of the State of the Church Committee and part of the Parochial Report Subcommittee.
Carlos?
Hello, I'm Carlos de la Torre. I'm director of St. John's in Bellefonte in Diocese of Central Pennsylvania, and I'm also a member of the Committee on State of the Church and on the Parochial Report Committee.
Great, thank you. Molly?
Good afternoon. Molly James. I'm the Deputy Executive Officer of General Convention, and one of the areas of my responsibility and that of our office is the data and research and collecting all the data that comes in from the parochial report. So I work with my colleague Iris on that.
And Iris?
Hello, my name is Iris De Leonardo. I am the data specialist and meeting assistant for the General Convention office. I oversee the intake of all the parochial reports from the diocese, and I also create the annual reporting of the parochial report results for the Episcopal Church by province and by diocese on our website.
Great, thank you all. It's one of the real blessings of getting to do this work is getting to work with Jane and others on Executive Council and the General Convention office and get a better sense of just how much work goes into it from Molly and Iris. And one of our little mottos when we think about changes that we're going to do the report is don't kill Iris. So we want to make sure it's stuff that's is actually accessible and doable and helpful for everyone. So I want to say a little something about the parochial report process. So I've been ordained about 24 years now, a rector for 18. So plenty of time filling out parochial reports, which I know is everybody's favorite thing to do in the church. The way the process works is House of Deputies State of the Church Committee is responsible for approving the form of the parochial report. Then we send it to the Governance and Operations Committee of the Executive Council, and they authorize, as Jane said, they authorize what we have approved, and so then it can go out. Then actually Iris and Molly and their team do a bunch of work to actually get it ready online and in paper form and redo all the instructions and everything so that it can get to those of you who get to interact with the report and to fill it out. Part of our work as State of the Church is responding to a resolution from previous General Convention to update and revise the parochial report. So we already inherited that work when we started. And at our very first meeting as the House of Deputies State of the Church Committee, we started calling ourselves the Hot Sauce Committee, try to be a little hot sauce for the church. We had a great meeting with the Gay Jennings, President of the House of Deputies, and our presiding bishop. to talk about the parochial report, and part of their encouragement was like, start over, think big. So we began work on a full revision of the parochial report, and then the pandemic hit, and we shifted into doing a special edition for 2020 that was addressing issues around the pandemic. And we'll get into this later. We've got about 2 more versions that we're going to work on. Part of, we put some questions in the description for the webinar that have been guiding our work. Part of what's been motivating is how can the parochial report be a tool to help congregations with the decisions they make? How can it be a tool for congregational vitality and not just a tax report or report card or the kind of terms that people tend to use for the report? So part of that is looking at how can we shift the metrics we're looking at. Right now, we really collect lag or trailing metrics that tell you what happened, but what are the things we could look at that would give a better sense of lead metrics that might help you make decisions for the future? What questions that could we ask that would kind of help assess vitality? One of the big issues, for me at least, is I notice that often when I interact with clergy, one of the first questions that comes up is, oh, what's your ASA? What's your average Sunday attendance? And it's become a bit of a gold standard by which we judge each other. And part of the problem is it's not a gold standard at all. It's important, but I think we've kind of overemphasized it. And so one of our goals is to look at attendance and how we can kind of place it in a better context so that when you look at your ASA or other attendance metrics, you can understand them within your own context. Part of that is getting a better sense of regional differences. So for example, if you look at church affiliation rates, compare Houston to Seattle, and to have an ASA of 200 in Seattle is really different than an ASA of 200 in Houston, just because the church affiliation rates are so different. Some people estimate that it takes twice as many people to get an ASA of 200 in Seattle than it would in Houston. That's not meant as a disparagement of anything. It's just how do we understand those? It's not necessarily apples to apples. How do we also understand ASA and other attendance metrics in the context of your neighborhood? What's the racial makeup of your congregation compared to what's happening in your neighborhood, and different attendance trends? Like, are you growing slowly, but church affiliation rates in your area are dropping rapidly, and so growing slowly or holding steady is almost growing? So a lot of it's just kind of getting a fuller sense, more contextual sense, so we can understand our own congregations and not just report out stuff and then try to compare everyone like every Episcopal church is the same across the country. One of the things we are looking at is average weekly attendance to get a better sense of the worshiping community. The ELCA already does this. Sometimes people say, oh, the parochial report, you're just going to try and hide the decline. No, we don't want to hide the decline. We want to try and figure out more clearly what the decline issues are and how to address them. Other issues we're looking at is, I've met with some people that have said, there's some research that suggests that when you ask the average American about their church attendance, they will include having attended a wedding or a funeral as having gone to church. So how can we look at things like that? Like, okay, what's your attendance for weddings and funerals? Those are all people who are making some kind of interaction or engagement with your community of faith, even if it's not a regularly scheduled worship service. So part of our guiding principle are that what we measure communicates what we care about. And that's one of the issues with the parochial report right now, is a lot of people think the only thing we care about is what's your ASA and what's your money, so we can figure out how to assess you, even though not all dioceses actually use the report for assessments. I once had a bishop tell me that he thought some of his clergy ministered to the parochial report. And so one of the issues is, if what we measure communicates what we care about, can we actually change our behavior by changing what we measure? And part of that is trying to shift to a sense of vitality. You can have a tiny congregation that can be really vital, and you can have a big congregation and maybe not be so vital. So it's trying to create a fuller picture, but it's above all, the thing that's been most important to me is how can I use the parochial report in my own congregation? How can my vestry look at it to make decisions for the future? So that's what I have to say. I want to turn it over to Carlos for his comments.
Thank you, Chris. In the parochial report subcommittee, we've broken ourselves up to help focus specific areas. And the areas that I've been focusing on over the last year plus we've been working together has been mainly the conversation, the overarching conversation of membership. What does it mean to be a member in the Episcopal Church, which is a institutional question, it's a theological question, and it's something that we need to wrestle with. The second thing that sort of has come up is the financial report section, that one page, which if you filled it out for this past year, you notice had more questions around the PPP loans and also some questions that did not make it to that report that we were vetting before the pandemic around what information would be helpful to report in the financial section. And then lastly, a question that has come up and that we're all really talking about, I think, across the church and on our subcommittee, how do we measure, what is the point of measuring of online participation? So I'll dive into those three areas specifically, but I'll begin with the conversation on membership. So, one of the things that we've looked at is what does the canon say around membership, right? Chris has heard me say this before and other members. I often look at the canons and I think of this sort of three-tier system of, baptized members, members on your books or in your books, and then communicants in good standing, right? And so we gauge these in different ways, and we actually ask specifically for those in your book. That's question 1 and 2 in the parochial report, and then the next question about communicants in good standing. And so we were wrestling with that. How is it helpful to make that distinction? What was the historical reason for that distinction? And in light of the pandemic, are these distinctions actually real? Community in good standing means that you are a baptized member who is pledging, who's received the Eucharist 3 times. Well, what happened if you didn't at all in 2020? Did you stop being a community in good standing? So we decided to sort of expand our thinking about that, and we're beginning to sort of dive into that more full force. The subcommittee is now beginning to look into that more closely, and it's my job to get a few voices in the virtual room with us to think about that theologically, institutionally, historically. We know that to change any of these terms and definitions would take not only having a time of discernment, but also pushing forward some changes to the canons and constitution of the church. So we're not going into this lightly, but we're also not deferring this. So we're beginning that process now. And I'm sure from your experience, you have members of your church who may not actually qualify under any of those 3 subcategories: baptized, community in good standing. So that's the reality we have. So how do we capture the full participation of our communities? As far as financial, you saw the different questions that were added this year. One of the things we did early on as we were beginning to discern how do we expand that was to contact specific CFOs, canons for finance in different dioceses, and a few bishops as well. There was questions that were, some of the questions that I think were really good that we were being asked to discern, including in future revisions, was, for example, having a line that asks how much of your revenue comes from leasing your space. And the way I think of that question is, it's sort of, you're in a parish that is in a busy part of town that it could be easy to do, then it's something worth noting. Second of all, also, as you think about vitality of churches, if you're in that sort of parish but haven't found creative ways to lease your space, then maybe that's something that in your vitality plan could be something to discern. How do you utilize your space to bring income? So those were the questions we were asking. Those are the things we were sort of asking for feedback about, around what questions would be helpful to add. And so we're beginning that process now in light of the pandemic, having questions around how much did you see in an increase now that you have opened up online giving, for example, looking at those metrics as well. And lastly here on online participation, this is something that is new that we're beginning to think about, and I've been thinking about since the beginning of all this, because my posture as a parish priest in a small church, a small rural church, was my sort of online ministry was going to be a pastoral move first and foremost. And since then, like many of you probably have experienced, it's become a form of outreach and evangelism, actually. And so we have these metrics that we've been keeping in some capacity. You know, my goal, and I think we'll agree on this, is to have those metrics be so important that we don't conflate them with ASA. We're not trying to just create a short-term solution for this pandemic, which has been we've not been able to be in person. And so we need to put a number on that piece of paper that makes us look good. But how do we calculate these numbers for the long term? So as Chris was saying, how do we take this information to be actually formative for when our vestries, our parishes begin to discern their future? So for example, if you saw a huge uptick in online attendance and participation and continue to see a steady increase, but you've been using an iPhone this whole time, maybe that's a sign to, well, maybe we can upgrade to something a little bit better, because it actually has been an investment, that investing in this would be a good thing, actually, right? Or maybe you've seen yourself have great attendance and sort of decline a bit, especially now, like churches like mine have opened again. And then maybe the thinking is, well, do we keep this online worship, and what does it look like in our context, given our viewing participation and so forth? So we are thinking about developing a way to gauge this that does not conflate it with ASA. And so we're beginning to think about how do we report ASA and how to report online participation separately. One of the ideas that I've thrown out is to sort of think about, well, if ASA is truly the Sundays in which we're able to attend, then how do we, separate that so fully from online that we say, okay, well, ASA is only those Sundays we met in person. So all those Sundays, as in my context, from January 1 till Palm Sunday when my church reopened, those Sundays, I'm not going to count as ASA because I couldn't have attendance because of guidelines from the diocese and the state. So not conflating those two, I think, will be key. And then lastly, is that, that metric for ASA is something we've been keeping tabs on for years. This is where Molly and Iris's work looks at those numbers, helps get those numbers together. So how do we keep those numbers separately so that we don't conflate data and information for the long term? Again, I think our goal overall, through our appointment to this committee and in our time in this committee during the pandemic, is to think strategically about change, not just simply changing things for short-term solutions, but for the long term and the future of the church.
Thank you so much, Carlos. Kate?
You'd think I have this figured out by now. I am unmuted. Thank you, Chris. I'm going to talk a little bit about the narrative questions, which were new this year, which received a wide mixture of reactions from people across the church. Our hope in the narrative questions by asking them was to allow people, a lot of the things we've already touched on, so I won't reiterate a lot of what Chris and Carlos have talked about, but to give the opportunity for this report to be a fuller expression of what's happening in our churches. We are storytelling people, and the story of Jesus is our main story, and our churches have so many wonderful stories that are behind the numbers. So these questions in particular, and what was such an unusual year, was an opportunity to share the story of what God is up to in our communities. It was also additionally, I found, and I know a lot of people I talked to found it as a wonderful opportunity to invite vestry or wardens into that conversation of, putting together some answers, inviting people into that editing process, brainstorming process, and reflecting and dreaming about what, looking back into the past year, and then dreaming about what God is calling us to do in our communities. And I think that's really fascinating, as well as one of my favorite parts of being on this committee was early on in our work, the archives prepared, it was like 50 or 70 page report on the history of the parochial report, which I found fascinating. And I thought, how interesting it would be if we have this snapshot of how, we've almost created a time capsule for our archives of how the church has been resilient, has had wonderful creative and adaptive change and continued to be vital through this pandemic this past year. So that was one thing with those unique set of narrative questions for this year. It's our hope to craft different ones for next year, and then moving forward to have some kind of question that just is a welcome invitation to communities and clergy to dream together and to give an opportunity for a little bit of qualitative data that's a little bit different than these numbers. So that's what I'll add. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kate. Jane.
As I said, thank you. As I said before, the Joint Standing Committee on Governance and Operations will receive any iterations of the report, of which we didn't think there'd be too many until COVID, and we've had to help you switch gears. And then eventually you authorize them for use. And so I think we're looking at, for the coming year, still being a sort of hybrid situation because we're still in this pandemic. But it's been really wonderful watching the process when reported by Chris and also here about struggling with what matters, what things that we count matter. And I learn something every time. So I'm in a listening mode to see what more Executive Council needs to know and can help with through this process. I'm thinking a lot about the shifts from not online, when nobody was online, and now we all are online in one way or another. What will we keep and what will we not keep? And that's out of practice. What will dioceses and congregations continue to do or not do once we're back to some sort of normal? And how we might count that as important if enough places hold on to adding virtual church or some form of worship. Those are the things that I'm looking for, and I'm enjoying the journey. If I can be helpful, let me know.
Thank you, Jane. Going to turn it over to Iris and Molly, and especially Iris, if you could comment perhaps a little on, obviously 2020 was a unique year with a lot of changes, and maybe comment on some of what you guys are doing with the data we're collecting.
Thank you, Chris. As I mentioned in my intro, I oversee the intake of the parochial reports from dioceses. And so part of that, we take that data and we build our annual reports based on diocese and province. And so I wanted to share where that's available. So on the General Convention website, we have the latest results that we have from 2019. But if you wanted to take a look at previous reports, they are filtered by the blue buttons up at the top. I won't go into each of them, but this is available at the General Convention website.org. And part of that, we've also added the Study Your Neighborhood page, which allows congregations to view their parochial report trend. In the past, or as we always have, we collect or we have available their trends by membership, plate and pledge, and average Sunday attendance. And so that is available using our new tool that we made available last year. And that looks like this page. Sometimes we've gotten requests for top congregations and membership or top congregations and plate and pledge. This tool allows you to do that by using the gears on the left side, or if you just wanted to go to a congregation and look at their data, you can easily select a diocese, the congregation you're looking for by city, and it'll show you their trend. And if you wanted to take a look at that view, you can always enlarge it. And then part of this, we've also provided their demographic information for the congregation. So this allows you to view their demographic information for you would click the Explore Neighborhood. And this will show you the demographics in that area for a 15-minute drive. This is a quick snapshot, but if you wanted to take a look further, you could select you can go into it further, like household, it'll give you more. You can download this into a PDF. And then we've also have a webinar. If you're interested in looking into it further, we do have available a webinar that we recorded, I think it was last year, that is on our website. And this is located at Study Your Neighborhood under Understanding Data Trends. That's part of our work. And it's also available through the Episcopal Church website, which links to the General Convention website. So if you're on either website, it'll direct you to those reports or information. And I mean, that's a little bit of what we do. I mean, I send out the reminders to all of our dioceses, our congregations. So many of the times, if you're getting a response, it's from me. So I'm going to let Molly go.
Thanks, Iris. I've just put links in the chat there to the resources that Iris mentioned, and that same website that has the webinar going into a bit more in depth on the online tool to explore data trends also offers a sort of collection of bit of a theological toolbox, shall we say, for how you might understand the trends and how you might understand the data and how the data might be useful to you all at a congregational level, and ways in which you might use it, you know, as Chris was mentioning, as a tool for strategic planning and sort of thinking big about life in your congregation and community. So we hope that all these data resources are useful to you all. So that's sort of where we've been, and a little bit in terms of where we're going. Obviously, as all of you who filled out the report know, that the report from 2020 was different and contains a whole lot of different data. So while we will be able to do some of the trends that included in some of the trend data we have, we will also have a much more robust report, because we have, thank you all, thousands of pages of texts of your amazing stories of life in this last year. And we are excited to dig into that information and to see what kinds of lessons and sort of wider trends and things we can learn, not just from the numbers that were submitted, but also from all of the narratives and all of the stories. So as we do each year in the summer, we will share you know, the results from the report as we've analyzed the data, and we will be looking this year both at the quantitative and the qualitative data. So that's a bit of where we're going.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'll offer a couple more comments, and then we do want to devote a fair amount of time to just questions, comments. So we are working on taking the 2020 special edition and modifying it a little bit for 2021. Some of that work we're doing right now is working on identifying and recommending to Executive Council a method for tracking online attendance. And let me just say, like, we don't want people to freak out about this stuff. Like, we know a lot of people, including my own parish, like, we don't have all this data. We haven't necessarily, we can get some of it, but we haven't always been tracking it. So as we look, especially at the 2021 report for this year, you know, some stuff is going to be optional, like we did with 2020. Like, if you have this information, provide it. If you don't freak out about it. Like, we know there are going to be asterisks for attendance numbers for this period of time. And so it's really like, how do we collect relevant, like, I mean, I loved Kate's comment about like, you know, we're creating a time capsule for the church right now. I mean, it's pretty great. So we are working on that. We want to do a modified version for 2021, and we are continuing to work on a full revision that would be used for 2022. Responding to one of the questions, we hope that we can have most of that done by the end of this year. We know it's very helpful if people can start the year knowing what they're going to be asked to track. So we want to provide that information as much as possible, and we're in a really weird time. So, you know, we don't, like we keep saying, like, this is also supposed to just be a tool, not like a mandatory tax form that you have to fill out and is a complete pain. Like, we want it to be useful for you and for your congregation, which is why things like the narrative questions, I mean, if I was in a rector search, I'd be like, hey, I want to see your narrative questions from your parochial report. That'll be really helpful information to read. And even if it's like, we don't want to fill this out, well, okay, then I think there's your answer, we know. So part of it is just not creating more stress. We want it to be a helpful tool. So modified for 2021, full revision, hopefully for 2022. We are doing some continued work on the finance page. Carlos has been working with some controllers from diocese and other people trying to get a sense of, and parish treasurers, people like that. How can we simplify it a little bit, make it a little more user friendly? Some of the other things we're looking at are how can we capture attendance at schools and camps and conference centers. I know there's some special reports that are done, but we'd like to be a little more intentional about that. I mean, a friend of mine's a school chaplain. He's doing church for 400 kids a couple of times a week. Like, that's not necessarily showing up in our attendance numbers, but there's some huge reach there. I did want to say that we are very much aware of Province 9, and even one of the members of our committee is now in a diocese in California, but previously from the Diocese of Columbia. And so we are aware of some of the issues of other countries and how we can try and make elements of the parochial report not only sensitive to issues for other countries, but for talking to the different ethnic ministries and getting a sense of what's going to be most helpful for everyone. At the same time, trying to make the report so it isn't sort of boiling the ocean, right? Like, we can't do everything, but we do want it to be a helpful tool for everyone. So I'm going to try to, yes, treasurers, I think I addressed that. Letting people advance notice. Sorry, I'm just trying to make sure I have. This isn't my greatest skill set, obviously. Any of you looking at the chat, feel free to jump in with.
Yeah, Chris, do you want me to read just the first question? Or?
Yeah, sure. Let's dive into a few.
Yeah. So
I know there was one.
So here's a question regarding reporting specifically around the financial and basic info for those churches in the Episcopal Diocese in Europe. And this is maybe a question for Molly and Iris, when it doesn't ask for country, just assumes you're in the US. And as far as the financial section, everything's in dollar signs. Most people simply just, who are calculating in euros, just put euros. But having that sort of dual or having that openness to report in euros is the question that has been asked.
In terms of the euros question, we are in conversation with the convocation, and we have an ongoing method with them by which their information is converted so that it can be put into the trend data in dollars. We would be glad to figure out ways to make sure that the same is true for other currencies as well.
Chris, there's another question up higher in the chat. I know we've talked about in the State of the Church Committee is if we're changing questions on the parochial report, making sure that we get that information out to congregations so they know what to be tracking. I know we talked about that a little bit, but is there anything you wanted to add about that? I know you just talked about not stressing about it and things are optional, and we know everything is changing all the time. Is there anything else we can say?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's part of why we're hoping that we can get a full revision for 2022 approved by the end of this year, working with the Executive Council. The dream, of course, would be that before the end of this year, we would communicate the new parochial report so that everyone could start 2022 knowing what they're going to be asked to track. So is that fair to say, Jane and Molly and Iris? I mean, that's kind of the goal, is so that you start the year knowing what you're going to be asked to track.
I think we're aiming for our October meeting for having that. That's our goal for sure, which would be then year end. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and for the narrative questions, I mean, we'll probably, as Kate said, I think, tweak it for this coming year because we're still in this interesting pandemic phase. But then, as Kate also said, stuff that question that could be asked every year so that you can track those specific things. So your qualitative data can be measured over time. So we're just trying to do that. And we're, one thing I want to say, I mean, we're saving the chat. We really are open to feedback, positive and negative. It's been really great just talking to parish clergy and other working in churches, like what would be helpful for you for us to be asking, so that can be utilized. And also it's, one of the things we did with the diocesan report was there was no kind of centralized sense of what are the assessment or apportionment formulas for every diocese. So trying to find some of that information out, finding out how many don't even use the parochial report at all to figure that out. And there's some really creative, there's some amazing stuff out there the churches are doing, and learning how to, how we can all learn from that and borrow it. I would also just give a plug to the great stuff that Iris just showed us and Molly are doing. My congregation is working on a strategic plan right now. We're using the congregational vitality assessment through FaithX and Episcopal Church Foundation, and through the General Convention website, and then through our own diocese, we've been doing a deep dive into some of the MapDash data story stuff, and it is really valuable. And I think to be able to use the parochial report along with this information for your specific context is a really powerful tool to take advantage of.
So can I ask a question in the meantime of the committee members? So it's obvious, I hope it's obvious that, things that are important to the church right now, especially are issues around racial justice and anti-racism and anti-colonialism and all those things that we need to account for. And those are reflected in the questions of the special report, and you are already working on that. Let's just go back to before COVID. Did you envision in your work that eventually some of those things would be normalized in questions that would appear from year to year to year? Or if not, I wonder how we go about doing something because that's counting something I think that really matters. And I just wonder, you had a big task to do just to see about reinventing this report.
I'll let Carlos and Kate mention. The one thing I will say is we are looking at adding more demographic data about the congregation. What's the racial makeup of the congregation? What's the age makeup of your congregation? But that's more information than we were gathering, but that doesn't really address your question. Carlos, Kate? Ideas? Yes, and we need to figure out how.
We've been talking about that. Yeah, it was almost like we were midstream and dreaming about the rewriting, what is this new parochial report going to look like, and beginning to work on it when COVID happened. And then it was like everything else in life, changing gears completely to, well, we need something, a temporary fix for this year.
The one thing I'll share is about the fix for this year was we reached out to Shaniqua Broken Leg to help us with that question. So from our end, our posture is, our subcommittee is with 6 people, our committee as a whole, about a dozen, and we only have so much knowledge. And so for us, our posture has always been to look outward as well. So I think as we continue to do this work for the year to come in the next year, is to sort of ask ourselves who out there would be good partners as we discern how do we capture that information.
Let's see. Will there be any type of best practices or standards for recording attendance for online services? Any type of multiplier that is suggested at a national level? Kate or Carlos? Yes.
Yeah.
That's exactly what we're working on right now. There's several different churches and denominations that are doing different things, and we're really looking at what different people are doing and what is out there, and the answer is yes, we're figuring that out.
Yeah, and there was a comment here from, see if I can find it, from Catherine, who is tracking online versus in person. That's something we're beginning to think about. Again, not conflating those two numbers. And so, yeah, we're beginning to think about that. And also a question about sort of having a universal platform. People are using everything, Facebook, Zoom, third-party softwares that push to different channels. And so I think that's what we're doing now, is sort of thinking about what is the broadest metric for this. And also at the same time, what's actually a helpful metric. Something that I've been leaning into personally is the term participation rather than attendance, right? It's sort of making a difference in language here. This is people engaging online with your parish, whether that's because they can't come to church, or maybe we've experienced some of our cases, some of our snowbird parishioners continue to be part of our parish when they move down to Florida for 3-4 months. And so thinking about that metric as being something that's not just capturing the need to report participation during COVID tide, but a number that is actually helpful for the long term. So we'll come up with something, but I think we're also sitting with, what is a helpful metric to actually keep tabs on, not just something to solve the problem of reporting attendance when we weren't able to be open physically.
Yeah, I mean, someone was going to jump in. Go ahead, Molly.
I was just going to say, building on what Carlos said, we're also working on a web-based application that would be an online version of the register book, the book that we keep in our sacristies to record our services, that would allow you to record the recommendations in terms of in-person and online attendance, and would feed into the parochial report system such that once the data has been entered there, the math of attendance and service numbers and things would be done for you.
That's awesome. Yeah, there are multiple methods out there right now, and we're trying to define the best one, and also the one that people will actually do, right? Like if it's complex math, it's not going to happen. So what's the easiest way? So there's an important question here I want to throw out, and I think we have some answers to it. As a leader of a small family-sized congregation, I wonder how many of the folks who are fashioning the parochial report have actually been members or clergy of family-sized congregations. How many of the clergy have served as part-time missional priests? What I see every year is the church sees itself as an alliance of corporate churches and has no understanding of the needs or accomplishments of smaller churches. I have some thoughts on that, but Carlos, Kate, any?
Carlos is unmuting.
Yeah, I'm a millennial priest. So those terms, I don't know what they mean ultimately. Is it family means 100 or less, right? I think. Whatever it is. I have 50, my ASA is 55. I'm in a small church. I'm in a rural-ish area right outside of state university system. And so I guess I think I share that comment of, it's me and a bunch of part-time people and a bunch of faithful volunteers. That's all I have. And I'm full-time. And I also have served part-time as a curate and an ESC director and a Dawson staff member. So I think I check those boxes as far as having that multiple experience. There's a question here that I think I want to link really quick with from Benji from Diocese of New Hampshire, who I've got a chance to meet at General Convention, about simplifying. That actually was a working goal for us, simplifying not only to make it easier for people in general, but also to make it practical, right, for all different scales of parishes. We don't have a full-time person looking at our finances or full-time parish administrator, which I don't have. Obviously, the pandemic made us expand it, right? One of our goals is to simplify, and it actually, you can make the argument, We made it longer. That's a fact. I think for us, though, we knew that we had to do that in a way to capture some of the information needed. However, that is an overarching goal, to simplify the parochial report for the reasons of, making it easier for more people to fill it out, and also to address the fact that you're right. There are smaller churches than big corporate churches in the Episcopal Church, and I'm one of them. So I asked myself that question: is this a report that I can and will fill out, or is this something I don't want to? And so I think that's something we're going to carry as we think about 2022, that big revision about making it accessible for all people in all parishes.
Kate, any comments on that?
Carlos answered that beautifully.
Yeah, and I do want to, there are a couple of questions about, the narrative questions were a lot of work, and I don't actually think whether they're a lot of work or not has anything to do with the size of your congregation. It's whether or not you want to do it. If you want to engage your vestry, do it, and figure out how it can be a tool for you to use. If you look at the narrative questions and say these are of no value to us, maybe that's the answer you write down. We don't want to do these. So that becomes historical information, which could be helpful too. I mean, we're not trying to burden people. We're trying to actually shift back to the size issue. We're really trying to focus more on ASA. And I think this is part of the problem vitality instead of ASA, right? Because by emphasizing ASA, the unintended consequence of that is the bigger your church is, the better your church is. I think what's the average ASA in the Episcopal Church? 75, something like that. I mean, we're trying to actually de-emphasize that the bigger your church is, the better your church is. This is about the vitality of your congregation, whether that's 1,000 people in New York City or 10 people somewhere in the middle of Nebraska. I mean, it's not about, part of what we want to do is break down these value judgments. I don't want anyone to fill out the parochial report and feel bad about their congregation, unless they feel like, wow, we're not really doing good work, but you can be a tiny church and be doing amazing work, and you can be a big church and just resting on your endowment. Like, we need a fuller, more generous sense of each congregation and each context, and not just use some of these numbers to kind of compare each other in a judgment way, but like we're all right. We're all on the same team. We're all part of the same Jesus movement, in a context in which religious affiliation is declining rapidly. And I think it remains to be seen just how much that's been accelerated by the pandemic, and how are we all responding in our own context. So part of it is like, let's get rid of some of the parochial report as a means of competition, and how can we use it as a way to assess where we are as a church, and what is the data telling, I don't think Iris is looking at this and going, wow, St. John's Ross went down 10 ASA. Can you believe that? Like, the question is, how do I look at that and say, what does that mean if we went down 10 ASA? How does that relate to my neighborhood? Like, what kind of evangelism do we need to do? What are all the various factors in that? I will stop talking. Jump in, Kate.
Chris, I think a couple of questions and comments about membership and tracking members in good standing, and tracking, how do you do that? And I know we've had so many conversations in the committee about this, and what was insightful for me once we started talking about it is which things are canonically required that we do track. And so some questions that we were like, throw it out. And it's like, wait, the canons require that we don't throw those questions out. But I think, and I've just moved from the West Coast to the East Coast. I know we had some things, somebody says here, I can track pledgers and I can track how many people are on our mailing list, but beyond that, and that's very much how I felt when I was in churches for 15 years in Seattle. It was, I have my list of pledging people and I have those people in our database. And honestly, that's the number I wrote in because I had no other means by which to come up with those numbers. And so I don't have any answer other than to say that those are questions that this group has been wrestling with faithfully, of what Carlos was talking about with theologically, what do these things mean? And what does it mean to be a member of our church? And do our canons need to change? But we do have them. And how do we faithfully answer these and have some kind of reasoning behind how we're answering these questions? I don't know if you want to add to that, Carlos.
I just think we need a culture shift, right? I mean, that's really that the ASA can be used as a weapon. I mean, I've seen that happen, and having some canonical change proposals would be kind of nice, for at least to force the conversation around the culture shift that's required to look at the right things. Vitality not being synonymous with size.
Yeah, I think that, that is so critical, how we do that and how we understand. I mean, I think we've all, we've got people who moved to Florida who are now members again because they can log in anytime. And I talk to people like, yeah, like I go to 5 churches now, right? Like, I got Christians probably log in and be like, oh, Chris is preaching again. I'm going to jump over to Grace Cathedral. I mean, you can do whatever you want now. So what are our standard definitions of membership? What do they even mean? And then a couple of people have been saying this. I mean, and it's tricky when we get to that communicant in good standing thing. Most of us, I have no idea. Not only pre-pandemic, I couldn't have told you. I'm not tracking who takes communion 3 times a year. And I know that I don't want to open up this whole open communion debate, but I'm in a diocese where open communion is almost the norm in most parishes. So it changes how you understand who's baptized and who's not baptized. And the notion that every Episcopalian has their baptism recorded in a book in one congregation at one time. And you have to move that registration from my book to Kate's book to go be a member of that. Like, I'm sure when all these canons were written, that made some sense, but it's not the reality. It's not the world we live in anymore. So how do we respond? And I think it's one of the issues that we're addressing, and Executive Council is how do we, and this is where the canons are an issue, right? Like we were trying to, like Carlos said, we were trying to figure it all out. It's like, well, the canons say we have to do this. So, and as Jane pointed out, ASA is not in the canons, right? They're like, the canons actually don't require a lot for the parochial report, but ASA is not one of them. Membership is. You all see other questions or comments you want to?
I just have something here that I would acknowledge about, can you talk about the impact of bivocational ministry upon the church? I think that is something that in that larger vision of something that's impactful, useful, and simpler, it's something to think about. What does it mean to have a parish where the priest is not full-time and therefore some of this information may not be as easily collected. I'm in a deanery here in central Pennsylvania where it's myself and then the rector of another church were the only full-time parish priests out of a dozen churches. And so something we're having on a hyper-local level is the conversation around what's the right shape for our parishes and dioceses. So I think that's something we'll think about, how do we make this simpler, more accessible to more people, especially in the bivocational model, you really are having more lay leaders step up. So what would be easier for the laity to take on as well?
Molly?
One of the other surveys that the Episcopal Church participates in is something called the Faith Communities Today survey, which is an enormous multi-faith survey of congregational life. And that also digs more fully into some of these kinds of questions like part-time clergy and whether or not the clergy are part-time by choice or not. So there will be some reports coming out from that much wider survey with our mainline other mainline denominations as well as other faith communities looking at some of those kinds of questions. So I think that's going to be a growing trend in terms of the data and research going forward.
And Molly and Iris, can you comment a little more on how the qualitative data from the narrative questions will be reported out, and other, part of what we were trying to get a sense is like who's using what methods online. Like there are a couple of questions asking like how will we learn about some of that?
It is absolutely our plan to report out some of the same quantitative information that we have, but then to go through and pull sort of high level trends and things from the qualitative data. The data just came in. It was just due May 1st. So we have yet to be able to fully dig into it. And I think we will learn a lot from it. And really the goal will be to share that, high level summaries with the church and to see what the data has to tell us.
Yeah, I'm super excited to see the analysis of the qualitative data. I feel like the church is one of the few organizations that doesn't do quantitative and qualitative, and we're really trying to shift back to that. As Kate mentioned, the original parochial report had that. So I think that's, I think that, Iris, anything you wanted to add on any of that?
I think Molly mentioned it.
And Kate put a very helpful for everybody. If you want to, we want your feedback. We want to know like what worked, what didn't work, what would be helpful. I mean, one of our recommendations in our blue report is that the state of the church and executive council should look at and review the parochial report more frequently than every 10 to 15 years. I mean, it needs to be an ongoing, we're in a fluid reality. So it, it's been a delight meeting with governance and operations and the executive council. I mean, they've been really engaged in this work and are thinking deeply about it. And, we've done some work with CPG. I mean, part of what's been exciting is getting all these different parts of the church all collaborating, working together. And they're, we all have our own experiences of the parochial report, but there are a lot of people working really hard to try and make this, that just love the church and really care about it and are not doing this to kind of beat people up, but to like, okay, how can we measure what really matters and how can it be helpful for all of us? So I now, instead of seeing it as a burden, now that I'm on the committee that helps oversee it, I'm like, okay, like how can I understand this as part of my work and not as, oh, this thing I have to do every March so I can get it in on April 1st or whatever the dates are. I think my diocese is earlier, but like seeing it as part of our work, like like tracking metrics and all this stuff, which doesn't come naturally to me. It's just part of our work in congregations. Let's see, ASA may not be required, but it is a useful short form number that is easier to relate to reality than membership, which can be fuzzy. Number of pledging units also helpful and real, but doesn't directly relate to vitality. I hope we keep both in the revised report. Yeah, I mean, we're not really looking to get rid of stuff, although I do think average weekly attendance is a more accurate and effective number than just ASA. But yeah, one of the things I should say we're really looking at in the full revision is we need these canonical things, communicating in good standing, etc. But we really want to emphasize more total active participants, which other denominations are. The Lutherans really emphasize that. So I don't know if any of you want to comment on that, but getting a real sense of not like, okay, who's baptized, who took communion 3 times a year, but like what are the total number of people who are active in this community of faith? And also, I don't know, do either of you want to comment on the outreach page? I know we've been talking about trying to revise that a little.
I can talk about that a bit. Part of the revisions for this year were, well, I think one thing that we kept hearing over and over again is that particularly early in 2020, those who are older were staying home more, and often the retired people were the volunteers for many of outreach programs in churches. And what we saw were younger people stepping in to fill volunteer roles that they hadn't before. And so that's why we added a column just to try to capture that, because it was interesting. I know I experienced it in my own church where a lot of families that had more time were eager and happy to step into volunteer roles with feeding ministries and things like food banks and soup kitchens, where they had not previously. And so that was kind of just an interesting thing that happened. So that we added that. So there was a little bit of adding to that report, not a lot, but just to kind of capture the changes that were unique to the circumstances of the pandemic. So I don't know what that'll look like moving forward, but that was a kind of a unique to 2020 reality.
Awesome. I mean, we're at 4. I want to respect people's time. And let's see. Okay. Any closing comments? As I said, Kate put our emails in there. We'd love to have your comments, questions, feedback. We know a lot of, people, as Kate said, people want to tell their story, and we're trying to get a report that lets people really tell the story of what they're doing, which can't always be done just through numbers. And there are a lot of great churches. There are a lot of tiny churches doing amazing stuff, and we need to lift all of that up, right? Serving Christ in whatever way that is vital within a community and congregation is what we're trying to capture and encourage. Let's see.
Well, there's a couple of things that have come up, Chris, but I think a lot of the scenarios that the people are sharing are things we're thinking about. A few things about small churches, about looking at the book. Do we need a digital platform? I hope throughout our time together, you've heard that we are, I think, in the same wavelength. We're asking the same questions. It's a culture shift, as Jane mentioned. So it's sort of how to do this pragmatically and strategically. I think that's what we're dancing with right now, is all these changes we know need to be done in some way or another, but how do we do them specifically? As we have brought up, a lot of these things are tied to the canons of the church. And so we need to think about that in a way that will actually happen. And what we present forward will actually have a reality of being changed, and therefore changing some of the ways we do the parochial report.
Awesome. Jane, anything you want to say from the Executive Council side about anything?
No, not to repeat myself too much, but I look forward to seeing you at our June meeting with the next installment, and then we'll work together to work on getting that, hopefully the final revised one for the end of the year, so that people do have advance notice.
All right. Any Molly, Iris, anything you want to share in closing?
We're all set. I've put our contact information in the email address in the chat as well, and glad to hear from folks if they have stuff particular to what we presented. Thank you.
Yeah, please send your questions, comments, suggestions. We do take it all in.
If anyone is watching this, and I'm not sure if it'll be, I think it's going to be recorded and doesn't have access to the chat, our parochial report email address is pr@episcopalchurch.org. Just wanted to, if you don't know it, that is our email. Please feel free to send comments. We can always forward it to Chris and Kate and Carlos in the subcommittee.
If I could just one
go
last
ahead. Yes,
thing.
please go for it.
There was a question about the manual of business practices, and can the new things be added to that? That would be through the treasurer's office, and we could always communicate that over when the next revision is done.
Yeah. A question about making sure that online worshipers aren't less than in person. Amen. I think, as you heard Carlos talking about, we're thinking very deeply about that. And it's, I've probably spoken to 3 parishioners in the last week who are all like, being able to watch the recorded version of the service at a different time on Sunday has been huge for them. So that they're not participating less. I mean, online recorded isn't less participation than being there live, in my opinion. So I think we're all aware of that and take that very seriously. That's one of the great opportunities this pandemic has given us, is a way to re-understand what it means to engage. So Carlos, Kate, any? Awesome. Thank you all. As I said, we'll save the chat, and please email us questions, comments, suggestions. We're all open to it, and we want people to be like, man, that parochial report was awesome. Thank you all. God bless.